Welcome to a fresh take on the news, putting you at the centre of the national conversation about the issues that matter to you most. Tonight, a European country remains under fierce attack from an authoritarian neighbour as the balance of power around the world shifts. With spheres of influence realigning, is the world as we know it changing? I'm Trevor Phillips, and this is The Great Debate. Each week, we go to the heart of the issue dominating the headlines. Tonight, nearly a month on from the invasion of Ukraine, our viewers from across the country and across the world will tell their stories and have their say. Here in the studio, our expert panel this week is Tim Marshall, author of several best-selling books on foreign affairs and international diplomacy, including The Power of Geography. From South Carolina, Rose Godemoller, former Deputy Secretary-General of NATO and lecturer in international security and cooperation at Stanford University. Travel writer and filmmaker Ash Bhardwaj, whose adventures include travelling 8,500 kilometres through European countries along Russia's border. And Cindy Yu, host of the Chinese Whispers podcast at The Spectator. The big question tonight: how is Vladimir Putin's war changing the world?
We have to stand up for a core principle that lies at the heart of the international order. Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness.
Democracy is precious. Democracy is fragile.
The Ukrainians and the Russians take potshots in the woods.
Each and every soldier who has committed this war crime, by order or not, will be held accountable.
There is the so-called liberal idea, which has outlived its purpose.
US lawmakers are captivated by this man.
Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace.
This is a turning point for the world. It's a choice between freedom and oppression.
OK, let's start, as always, with our viewers' panel and talk to Kat El-Karu. Kat.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm watching my children become more and more disenchanted with the world. They're aware of man-made war and man-made climate change. I've tried to explain the war in Ukraine to my 16, 12 and 8-year-old boys, but there's really no explanation other than power and greed and an inability to protect vulnerable people in a meaningful way. My 16-year-old has even said he'd go and fight in Ukraine. He wants to fight to stop war, right? So, but in a world where democratic leaders can't come together to stop despots like Putin causing the destruction that he's already caused, is democracy worth fighting for?
Well, that's a question for everybody, whatever age you are. Thank you, Kat. Let's come to that question. Is democracy worth fighting for? Rose Godemoller, what's the answer? What are you going to tell young people?
Absolutely, yes. Their lives so far have really benefited from the stability and the abundance that has come after World War II, because we've had stable democratic systems, particularly in Europe. And my heart goes out to the children of your first viewer who spoke, because, of course, suddenly seeing that world shaken so close to home, right in the center of Europe, must be terribly, terribly worrying. We see, of course, war and extremist attacks all over the world, and I'm a little ashamed sometimes we don't pay as much attention to them. But honestly, this war in the heart of Europe seems to be upending all of what we have achieved since World War II. And so I would say, yes, that system is absolutely worth fighting for. And it's not just about economic prosperity, but it's about the ability to live together in a way where we don't have to fight. So I really think that we need to do everything we can to advance this effort to support the Ukrainians.
Thank you, Rose. Tim Marshall, it's somebody else's country. Is it really worth it?
Yes, because we are fighting for the future. And the support that's going to it is not just to support Ukraine, it is to support the democratic world. Because if this does fall, then it shows that might is right, that aggression will pay off. And the big picture is, and you alluded to it in the introduction, there is now, I believe, an acceleration towards what I thought was already happening, which is the authoritarian world, of which Putin is part of, China and other countries, and then not the West, I think that's an outdated concept, but the advanced industrialized democracies, including places like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea.
It's wider than Western Europe and North America.
This is not just about West-East. This is about the authoritarian countries and the democracies with all their faults.
All right, let me come back to you, Kat. How do you explain it to your children, and have you persuaded them?
Yeah, I've persuaded them that democracy is worth fighting for, but I think that they're troubled by the amount of destruction that has happened. So we hear about sanctions, but Putin has already destroyed Ukraine, its infrastructure, its buildings. People that go back will have to take years to rebuild that country. So they don't see this as a win already. They don't see it as a win now.
OK, thank you, Kat. I want to talk to Chris Roberts. Chris, I think you're in the Isle of Man. What's your view about this? Is it worth it? Is it worth the battle?
Yeah, of course it's worth the battle, as your other contributors have just mentioned, for all those reasons. I think when you speak about changing the world or changing the future, one of the things we have to be aware of is the Cold War. The Cold War finished in 1991. I think that will re-emerge out of this, whatever happens in Ukraine. But this time around, Putin's got other weapons. He hasn't just got conventional weapons or WMD. He's got the weapons of social media. He's got the disinformation, energy and food supply, the economy of that. And that's going to affect everybody in the world, not just the West.
OK, Chris, thank you. Let me come back in studio. Cindy, you. The stakes here are high, but are they, in your view, as high as, I think, being made out by everybody here?
This grand battle between democracy and authoritarianism.
Yes.
I think it was always thus, ever thus. You know, I think democracy, if we think about it in our world, is such a new concept and is a brilliant concept. But modern democracy, as we know it, even in the West, is only a few hundred years old. And that's why it's so valuable, because for the first time in thousands of years of human history, you know, there is this real freedom of speech for ordinary people. And, you know, going back to your previous caller's question, you know, is it worth fighting for? You know, as a Chinese person, I look at this war and I think, if it happened with China and I was disagreeing with the war, I couldn't say that within China, and that would be something deeply held, and you couldn't say that. Look at China's zero-COVID policy now. It's completely arbitrary lockdowns when they happen. People have very little recourse to changing that policy because there is no freedom of speech, there is no accountability for the government. And so when you put yourself in that situation, democracy is absolutely worth fighting for. I guess my point is just authoritarians are not going anywhere. They're always going to be with us, I believe, especially when you've got the history, the complicated history and the cultures of the countries involved here. And so all we can do is try to coexist and try to protect democratic interests wherever possible, and not think we can eradicate the other side.
There's a problem here, isn't there, that potentially there's one bad guy who is running one rogue nation, and we might solve it or we might not solve it. But is this something that's going to change the world? Because there have been bad guys before.
Well, I'm hearing what Kat was saying about speaking to her kids and the way they were feeling about wanting to go and defend Ukraine. when I was in Ukraine, noting just how much people wanted to defend their democracy there. They tasted tyranny under the previous president and they gained freedom. And I think by setting good examples and allowing places like Ukraine to stand as good lights against tyranny, that's the way that we can start to set a competition against autocracy. And I think that's the way we can do it, by making sure that places that have found freedom, they get to keep it.
All right, let's go back to war and talk to Joe Constant. Joe.
Evening, Trevor.
Good evening, Joe. What's your view?
Putin could be setting a precedent in the terms of deciding which country to overrule and take control, knowing full well there will be no recourse due to fears of a Third World War. In 2014, Russia demonstrated similar behaviour with the Crimea War, so this is not the first time. Since then, the West could have done more, but everyone fears antagonising Putin, and is why they just sat on their hands.
OK, so hold on there for a second, Joe. Let's talk to Julie Fay. Julie is in, I think you're in Tewkesbury. Julie, what do you make of this?
Well, I'm puzzled. So many people, possibly even Russia, have been surprised that Russian forces have so far failed on the ground. And we have this impression of this vast army. They parade on Red Square, and we have this impression of a well-equipped, vast army. But what we're seeing does not match that image.
That's a very interesting point. Let's come back. Rose Gottemoller, this is an interesting point. Certainly on the ground, the Russians don't seem to have done the damage or made the advances that people thought they might have done, and indeed they thought they might have done. Are we put in danger? You've been number 2 at NATO. Are we in danger of overestimating their impact on the situation?
I think there are really two factors here. One, I'm going to differ with your viewer a bit. A lot has been done since 2014. Ukraine, as a good partner of NATO in our Partnership for Peace program, was undergoing a lot of transformation in its armed forces. Yes, they were defeated by the Russians in 2014, taken by surprise, but they learned a lot from that experience. They've also been fighting Russian forces in Donetsk and Luhansk in the east part of the country. So they accumulated a huge amount of combat experience and savvy in the intervening few years. And that is one reason why the Russians are bogged down so seriously. The other points to, I think, a really deep problem in Russia is corruption. They poured so much money into modernizing the Russian armed forces, but in the end of the day, their fearsome armed forces haven't looked so good on the ground, with things like the tires blowing out because they were cheap Chinese tires that somebody got on discount, I suppose. So there are issues like that as well, and the lack of good planning, the lack of logistics, the lack of enough petrol to keep running. All of these things, I think, point to the fact that the Russians did not come to this fight well prepared.
OK, let's come back to Julie. Julie, Rose is just making the point that actually a lot has changed in the last few years, and that though the Russians might look a bit rocky, they are actually a much greater force than they were even in 2014.
Yes, I was listening to the points that Rose made about them not being very well equipped, not having that much strategy about things, and listening to your footage at the beginning of the programme with Barack Obama saying that they are a regional country fighting regional opponents. I wouldn't want to underestimate Russia for 1 minute, but I'm just wondering where the truth and the reality actually match up.
OK. Tim, truth versus reality.
They are a formidable military power still. They've got this so badly wrong, but a fish rots from their head. On February the 24th, more than 50% of Russia's foreign reserves were still outside of the country. That tells you that he had not told the economic class, even in secret, what was coming. If he didn't tell the economic class, he didn't tell half of his military. They didn't have the plan that he wanted them to then fulfill. Briefly, also what has been happening in the last 7 years, as well as all the things that Rose has said, I think it's very important to point out Britain sent at least 2,000 NLAWs, these are the new generation anti-tank weapons, in the run-up to this war. America sent a couple of thousand javelins, and these are the things that have been taking out the Russian armour. There was a lot done for Ukraine over the past few years, short of actually being there as well.
OK.
I just wanted to emphasize, Trevor, it was the other way around. I was saying that since 2014, Ukrainians have really trained up very, very well, working very hard to build up their armed forces with the help of NATO, in partnership with NATO. It's the Russians that I think have really fallen down in this fight.
OK, thank you. Let's go back to our viewers panel and talk to Jonathan Botha. And I think you have a view about the way this is changing the rest of the world.
You know, Trevor, I really think that what we have here is a crisis. I'm not trying to be alarmist or anything, but I've been doing a lot of research just personally on the states of democracy around the world. And Tim raised a very good point. I think that talking about the West is a very antiquated idea. I think it's better for us to look at the idea of freedom and, you know, more specifically liberal democracy and what it is that we stand for. And every year, Freedom House puts out a document which basically outlines it's like a litmus test for what democracy looks like around the world, and they give it a score. And what we've seen is that over the past 16 years, that score has consistently gone lower. And in fact, 8 out of 10 people do not live in any sort of democracy at all. So only 20% of people live in a democracy.
We are, in fact, going to go on to talk about exactly that point, the clash between authoritarians and democracy. So coming up after the break, we're talking superpowers and whether we missed the signs of a changing world order long before the Ukraine invasion.
Russia and China fashioning a new world order.
Regarding our bilateral relations, they are indeed developing steadily in the spirit of friendship and strategic partnership.
For Vladimir Putin, it is perhaps more important than it is for Xi Jinping.
China, India, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. I am sure these countries do not want to be just in a position when Uncle Sam orders them something and they say, yes, sir.
Ukrainian government is confirming that they are now engaged with Russian soldiers. Air raid sirens fill the airways.
In the distance, artillery rains down.
It feels very close to the centre of... There's one.
They found this devastation to their apartment.
Lots of people live here. Quite a few of the windows of the houses have been blown out by the blast.
And it feels that it's changing each day.
And it's moving this way.
And over there is Dover.
We track the changes happening to our world right now.
I think it's a procession of the Taliban. There they are, right here.
Would you, as Prime Minister, be able to look them in the face?
Let's have a look at both of those two things. I just want to say thank you for having the courage to speak to us.
We do genuinely believe in what we do, to show the truth.
I thought there was an astonishing story there.
Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's Scotland correspondent.
love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Welcome back to the great debate. How is Vladimir Putin's war changing the world? After the end of the Cold War, a general consensus emerged about the power balance around the world, or so we thought. But while we in the West were perhaps looking inwards, distracted by issues like Brexit or Trump's victory, did we miss the signs of changing priorities for others? Let's talk to Musa Indaya from our viewers panel. Musa, you, I think, have a view about what's been happening in the rest of the world and the way that they view it.
My question is who's defined the new world order? That's my question. Because if you look at, for example, in Africa, as you said, in the world order, I mean, China is now dominating African trade. And that's based on because Africa needed infrastructure. They needed people who invest in the country. And China is just giving them what they want in comparison to European countries, which is offering democracy. But the African, they're more into getting jobs and getting trade. So I think that's Europe need to review. I think yeah.
That's a clear question. So now Musa's question for our panel is, who is defining the new world order? And Cindy, a lot of fingers are pointing at China now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think China is not leading the world order just yet. It wants to, certainly. It wants to challenge the existing world order. And to Musa's question, you know, who defines it? I think it's the institutions that this world lives under, because we are in a stage where we do pay heed to the UN, to the WTO, to the WHO, to the IMF, all of these international institutions that were built up during the 20th century under a time when the West was undeniably in dominance. You know, they were able to set the rules. And when America doesn't like a certain rule, it can find the certain loopholes. And that's the kind of privilege that China wants to have, not necessarily to tell everyone else what to do, but to be able to change the rules when it suits them. And that's the kind of challenge that it wants to do, to give to the world order. But I don't think it's quite there yet. And I don't think it will be there with China and Russia replacing America and the UK, perhaps. It's never going to be that easy.
But China is going to be patient, it sounds like. It's going to wait.
Yes, I mean, I think China, you know, Chinese people like to talk about 5,000 years of history. I mean, almost certainly a political narrative, almost certainly not 5,000 years of history, but it likes to see itself as a long game. The question, though, is, does President Xi think he has that much time? You know, he's 69 years old. This year he begins his third term in government, probably president for life. He wants to set a legacy. He wants to be the next Mao Zedong. He wants that kind of legacy, and that's why he's putting on the pressure for Taiwan, which the Russian war has scuppered. And that's why for him, there is a counting clock for his legacy.
OK, let's delve into this a little bit further and talk to Qingchu Bu. I think you have a view about China's strategy.
Yes, indeed. It's a very critical time. And no doubt at all, the world relies on China for trade, the so-called global supply chain issue. But economic dependency could be exploited for political gains. And as we always say, whether China is a real superpower, and it depends on whether it has we can super influence on global affairs and global governance. So in the current Ukraine conflict, and so far, China has not taken significant action, but the world is watching to see what China does next.
I just want to pick up this point you're making with Paul de Janon, who actually is from Panama. Paul, what is your view about this new power rising in the East, as people keep saying?
Yeah, well, in Latin America, the relationship with China goes back, and with some countries, a long time, a long way. But most recently, I think 20 years ago, when chairman of China, Hu Jintao, I think, if I pronounce it right, when he came across to the continent and he built up some relationships there, political relationships, which then turned to financing and loans for the local economies and then direct investments to the different countries. So they've established themselves very well in Latin America now, from Mexico all the way down to Argentina. The relationship with some of those countries are very established. And most recently with COVID, China was the first country to offer help in PPE and vaccinations and all this. So some of those nations are very grateful. So will that turn into some kind of, they need to rebuild those economies. So will they be going back to China, who has very much easier credit lines for borrowing than, say, the US and Europe?
Tim Marshall, you've written several books, actually, dividing the world into maps, spheres of influence and so on. What's your new map telling us about China's influence?
Well, it is huge, and Cindy made the point about the institutions, because there's now the Shanghai, the banks that China put up to be in opposition to some of the big Western organizations. I did want to bring it briefly back to this Russia situation. China would much rather not to have had to have made any decisions at the moment. They were going to play a long game with Russia as the dominant partner. Russia does appear to have looked for them to assistance, and the Chinese are thinking, I'm really not sure we want to do that. So that limitless friendship that was declared between Putin and Xi just 2 months ago has proved to have absolute limits. And I think crucially to try to understand why China is so reluctant is that for decades its policy is non-interference in a sovereign state. And what is this if it's not interference in a sovereign state? So China is very reluctant to get involved in this.
OK, Rose Guatemala, we're hearing about China's influence, but nobody seems too clear about whether they are keen to exert that influence or whether they want to stand back, whether they think the Russians can be controlled, or whether they're even interested in doing that. What's your view?
Well, the Chinese are walking a very thin tightrope. And I think they don't want, I agree very much, they don't want to be asked this question right now. They're not very keen. There is a rumor out there, for example, that Foreign Minister Lavrov's plane turned around on his way to Beijing last week. That's been stoutly denied by both Beijing and Moscow. But nevertheless, it's clear that the Chinese are tiptoeing along this tightrope and trying to figure out what to do. President Biden, of course, in the United States is doing everything that he can to convey to the Chinese that they are going to pay a cost if they do try to get around sanctions, provide military equipment to Russia, and so forth. But I think in a way he's probably also dangling some carrots to say, let's see what we can do to work together to get out of this particular crisis and carry a more positive agenda forward. I think we have to in many ways. Otherwise, the world economy will collapse, and some major international institutions like the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime will collapse.
Rose, thank you. Let's finally go back to Jean Spooner on the wall. Jean, Rose Guatemala says we've got to dig ourselves out of the hole. We've been talking about one potential power that might help us. What's your view?
Well, China definitely hasn't put a foot wrong at all. They've been buying up territory all over the world, mostly a lot of in Africa. They've been making sure that they rule okay, and they must look at us and have a laugh, because here we are, weak, navel gazing, virtue signaling, as if we don't live in the real world. And they know that they don't have to do what Russia's doing. They don't have to kill anybody. They just make us into consumers. We've made ourselves into consumers, and they've made us into consumers. So that they see our weakness, they see everything about us, the lack of dignity, the fact that we think we're gods, we think we all deserve the best. We instant gratification. We're not prepared to take the long road, the long windy road. We just want instantly what we want, and we want it now, and we want it cheaply. And they see that. That's the way to conquer the world, not to bomb anybody.
All right, this is the great debate. Up next, are countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran gaining influence around the world?
Boris Johnson is about to cozy up to Saudi Arabia, even though they've just executed 81 people. Global turmoil, reshaping global diplomacy.
We have long-standing relationships with this part of the world.
Should we be accepting more oil from Saudi Arabia?
If it is a long-term strategy to make us dependent on Saudi Arabia instead of Russia, then I would take a fundamentally different approach.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
This is The Great Debate, where this week we're asking, how is Vladimir Putin's war changing the world? And we're looking ahead to what the future might hold now. And I'm going to hear from Mark Hill now. Mark, look ahead for us. Talk to us.
My question is, once the war is over, will Russia return to its place on the world stage?
Have you got a view about that, Mark?
I'm just worried that money will take over because everybody's worried about bills now. Will they just say, let's go back to how things is, forget everything, because it's all about money?
OK. Mark's question. Once the war is over, will Russia return to its place on the world stage? Tim Marshall.
I doubt it. Financially, yes. We are still going to want to buy their oil and gas, but they don't make anything else, so we don't want anything else from them. So if you put that to one side, no is the answer, because we are now in a post-Cold War era. This is a dividing line, so we're not going back. They're not going to have that place. They're not going to be a partner under the current governmental system. I really believe this is a watershed in relations. You mentioned all those other countries as well. We are still in a multipolar world. We're going to go back to a form of bipolar world, and countries will fall in, most of them, between one of the two great powers, the Americans and the Chinese. And Russia is just a junior partner for the Chinese.
But why would we not go back? I mean, oil is oil. It's as much oil now as it was
But you know,
6 weeks ago.
We're already buying their gas and oil. Even now, they're getting $1 billion a day. They're spending about $1 billion a day on the war. So, I mean, it's a very crude example, but you could say we're bankrolling their war. We're not. It's more complicated than that. But we're already buying their oil and gas. Germany is already backsliding a little bit on sanctions, but this is a dividing line. What they have done in Ukraine is of such magnitude that there's not any coming back in the next few years, at least.
Ash?
I think Tim's right. What they've done there is so horrific, and so many nations have stood up and said they want to see Vladimir Putin tried for war crimes. I can't see how we could ever normalise relations with Russia in the same way again. I also think, seeing Russia's operational failures in Ukraine, we run the risk of mistaking the whole thing is going wrong for him. We have no idea what Vladimir Putin's strategic objectives are. Now, there was this talk about whether he wanted to capture Kiev quickly and so on, but they've also taken the entire south coast of Ukraine, where it touches onto the Black Sea. We've heard a lot about how Russia's got this massive information war capability, but very little of it has been directed towards us in Europe or North America. I think Putin knew from the outset that once he started this campaign, he was never going to get us on side to believing that it was just. However, they've been doing a lot of information stuff into Africa, into Southeast Asia, into South Asia, and Russia has the ability to think in the strategic way, in the long game, in the way that we just don't. Putin has for a long time talked about wanting to shake up the New World Order, and he's certainly done that. He may accept the division between the authoritarian world and the democratic world as a price that he's willing to pay to achieve his objectives, which might just be more influence in places like Africa and Southeast Asia and South Asia.
OK. Let's come back to the war. Linda Porter, on the other side of this, do you think things can bounce back to being as they were?
Not the way it stands. I mean, the British people at the moment are paying 60% in fuel tax. Now, instead of immediately lowering that rate to ease the pressure on the economy, what do we see but Boris going cap in hand to Saudi, to sidle up to Mohammed bin Salman, who himself is responsible for recently executing at least 81 people. Now, isn't this hypocritical? While sanctioning Russia and condemning Putin for his barbaric actions in Ukraine.
OK, Linda, stay there. Carlos Henry, what do you think about this? Where is this episode going to leave us, ethically?
Good evening, everybody. I hope that it will keep us more united, but on the other hand, there's always the chance that the divisions of the political divisions will prevail. Personally, I see this probably coming in the last decade. We have seen, this is more an effect in the West, we have seen countries becoming more isolated. We have seen democracies becoming more focused on themselves than in finding unity. We can all think examples of the West becoming increasingly polarized internally and alienated with others. And this all favors only totalitarianism.
Okay.
And but I hope that there is the possibility to get out of this better and more united.
Thank you, Carlos. Cindy, this is an interesting point, isn't it? That we're all united today, we're democracies versus authoritarianism, but in the medium and long term, actually, this could lead to isolationism.
Oh, in terms of reversing globalisation?
Yeah, that each country starts to look after itself.
I think that economic interests are not going to let that happen. You know, I think in the way that your viewers have already picked out, you know, we're going to Saudi Arabia. Clearly, ideology is not the be-all and end-all of things. And, you know, if we're talking about moving factory work out of China, where are we moving it to? Vietnam. Last time I checked, they weren't a democracy either. So I think economic interests are always going to speak first. And by the way, that's not necessarily a bad thing, you know? As your average voter, as your average citizen, if you want to have a good standard of living, your government should be looking out for your national self-interest. Sometimes that's ideology, but not always. Sometimes that's living costs. And so I'm, you know, cynical and I'm sanguine, and I believe that countries should be doing the best they can for their people. And, you know, sometimes ideology has to take a back seat on that.
OK. Rose, America has been through its own little period of isolationism. Do you think that, as we've been hearing here, that the outcome of all of this might be to force nations to say, we can't trust stability in the rest of the world, we can't trust our partners, so we've got to look after ourselves?
Yes, we've just been through our episode of America First, that's for sure. But one thing that this crisis has done is really produce this amazing coherence in Europe, but not only in Europe, and the point is well taken, the Asian partners and allies have also been really joining in this effort to counter Russia economically and to throw sanctions at it. And so I think that coherence will, I mean, you mentioned, yes, that Germany is starting to perhaps show a little weakness on sanctions, but I think in general, the shock of this notion that, again, the big autocratic tyrant can come in and break apart what has been a young and vibrant and growing country in just such a stark way, make a grab of this kind, I think has been shocking to a lot of people around the world. And so I actually hope that there will be a degree of coherence that comes out of this politically for some period of time. We will see. We will have to see what happens. But I do think that that's one point. The other point, if I could, Trevor, just really quickly.
Yep, very quickly.
We're talking about some old guys here, 69 years old. Putin turned 70 this year. Biden himself is in his 70s. There has to be a generation change, and that's what interests me. Are we going to see some younger leaders like Volodymyr Zelensky stepping forward now in the wake of this crisis?
OK. My temptation to say don't write off people in their 60s is very strong, but that's self-interest. After the break, we're looking at how countries have responded to the humanitarian crisis caused by the Ukraine invasion.
What I saw was a human tragedy on an epic and heartbreaking scale. And I have to tell you, it broke my heart. Britain is a country that always does right by those in need.
So much stuff, so much people. We try help these people because war is hell.
Yes, it's political games, it's diplomacy, but right now, people's lives are at stake.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
Everything that a journalist might want in a story.
A story that you'd be proud to have filmed.
But they didn't want journalists to see the real story.
It was very tiring, it was very sad, it was very scary at times.
Hey, there's no need for this.
But you have to keep going.
Oh, look at that.
You don't want to lecture people, but you do have to give them the facts.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
How is Vladimir Putin's war changing the world? That's what our viewers, panel and studio guests are discussing this week. And for the millions of people displaced from Ukraine, it's not only the wider world that's changing, but their own world too. Let's start with Elaine Hamilton from our viewers panel. Elaine, can you talk to us about your experience? Because you've come from Kharkiv, I think.
I was forced to flee from Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, which lies very close to the Russian border. Kharkiv, it was one of the first places to be attacked in this war, and I should say that Russian missiles strikes, they continue to strike our native city. And Russia already has shot thousands of civilian objects, unfortunately.
OK, you're now in Dublin. How did you get there?
First of all, we left Kharkiv and traveled to Poland. This journey to Poland took us nearly 4 days. But when in Poland, me and my cousin, we didn't know where we could go next. And we were stuck in Poland. And to tell the truth, we were in the desperate. And we were stranded and we didn't know what to do next.
OK.
And then,
OK, you have a question for our panel, I think.
I have a question. My question is, has the Ukraine invasion encouraged cooperation between other countries?
Thank you, Elaine. Elaine's question for the panel is, has the Ukraine invasion encouraged cooperation between other countries? Ash?
I think one of the things that Vladimir Putin hates more than anything is alliances. He likes countries that are clients of his that do what he tells them to do. And this has shown the value of alliances, shown the value of NATO and the European Union, and how cooperating allows smaller countries to resist that kind of negative influence. And the way the European Union has responded together to the challenges, the military challenge, the political challenge, and the humanitarian challenge has really been quite impressive. It's, I think, been a lot more powerful and positive than anyone expected it to be. And it's a shame that it's required a tragedy to do this, but I do see countries working together much better than they have done in recent years.
Tim, do you agree? And do you think that's model for the future, or just this one time?
I'm reluctant to disagree, but I actually only slightly disagree. The European Union has not had a good war, diplomatically. It has been the nation-states that have responded mostly individually. We will take X, we will do Y. I don't think it's been... There is coordination, people are talking to each other, but it's mostly been individual countries, whether it's Germany pretty much changing its foreign policy after 70 years of neutrality, or whether it's Poland opening its doors in a magnificent way, but I think it's been done at the nation-state level. Now, that's not to say that the European Union has not actually been strengthened by this crisis, by realising they must stick together, otherwise they will fall apart.
OK. Let's go back to our panel and talk to Elaine Hamilton. Elaine, what do you think about this question of whether countries are cooperating more effectively?
Well, I think the UK scheme of £350 a month to help people take in refugees is good, but it has come a little too late. And I'm not sure it's generous enough. I live on a pension and I have a spare room. And I'm thinking of volunteering, but I'm very worried about the rising cost of living and how it might impact on my finances.
Cindy, from where you stand, do you think, do you agree with Ash or with Tim that this has been such a jolt that there's going to be a kind of different spirit of cooperation or not?
Well, I think both Ash and Tim are right. It's a crowd-pleasing answer. But if I can add another dimension where cooperation is not happening, is that before the war, we thought that India and Israel were Western allies. And I think the war has shown that actually nations have their own interests. If you look at India and Israel, both of them abstained on that UN resolution that Russia put forward, because both of them have different relationships with Russia. You know, Israel in the Middle East needs Russia as a balance against Iran. India needs Russian arms. And, you know, it's easy to think of the world as liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, but it's more complicated than that. And even democracies like India and Israel, we can't really rely on. And President Biden's doing all he can to put pressure on countries like that. But I think it just goes to show at the end of the day, it's your national interest. So that is the little bone of contention where cooperation is not happening.
All right, Rose, what do you think? Do you think this has given us a shock on the West, whether we describe that in terms of values and ideology or geography? Do you think this episode has given us a shock that will bring us together for good, or is this just something that's going to happen in a sort of rush of generosity and solidarity with Ukrainians?
I think the future is going to have to tell on this. You know, we were famously, and I will say here, coming out of World War II and building up our institutions and caring for shattered Europe, we were famously joined together in putting the Marshall Plan on the table. The United States, of course, took the lead in putting a lot of resources on the table to rebuild Europe, but others joined as they could. And I think that kind of spirit and momentum led to the original founding institutions that led to the European Union. So there was a lot of momentum that came out of efforts in World War II to do the right thing. And I know in the United States, they're talking about, again, a Marshall Plan for Ukraine to rebuild that shattered nation after this terrible invasion. And I hope we have a peace settlement and the Russians get out. But I know that the United States is intent on getting others of its allies and partners to join in, helping to finance a recovery for Ukraine and a rebuilding for it. So looking to the future, I see, yes, that there will be ways that we can stay cemented together. It won't be easy, however, but I hope that spirit of the Marshall Plan will carry us forward.
Thank you, Rose Guatemala. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. Just remains for me to thank our panellists here in the studio. Ash Bardwaj, Cindy Yu, Tim Marshall, and from South Carolina, Rose Guatemala. Of course, it's you at home who are at the centre of this conversation. On next week's episode, we're asking, is racism in sport here to stay? If you want to be part of that discussion, you can get in touch by emailing thegreatdebate@sky.uk. For now, I want to thank everybody on tonight's viewers panel on the wall for your thoughtful contributions. Thank you. And, of course, to you at home, keep talking. We'll see you again at the same time next week for The Great Debate.